Yeah, we are back, baby, and we are black here on WLTH 1370 AM. That's 92.7 in the FM dial. It is Friday, February the 28th, 2025. Yes, it is. It is the end of Black History Month. February 28th, last day of Black History Month. If you've listened to WLTH over the past 4 weeks, you've listened to many of our hosts and many of our affiliates celebrating the accomplishments or documenting the many trials and tribulations of people of sub-Saharan African descent. But many of these accomplishments, trials, and tribulations can all be traced back to one single event. And that is the colonization of Africa. Starting in the 15th century with the Kingdom of Portugal, the last 5 centuries of black life, from the civil rights struggles in America to the revolution in Haiti to the fight to end apartheid in South Africa. None of this happens without European colonization. And that is why it is important to talk about an event that happened exactly 140 years ago this week. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 was a very pivotal meeting of the European powers, along with the United States and the Ottoman Empire, held in Berlin to regulate the colonization and trade in Africa during the height of the Scramble for Africa. Organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, it aimed to prevent conflict among European nations vying for African territory by establishing rules for claiming land and resources. Let's watch this video, or at least for you, listen to this video that goes even deeper in depth.
In the late 19th century, European powers were in a fierce scramble for control over the vast and resource-rich continent of Africa. This era, known as the Scramble for Africa, saw European nations vying to expand their empires by claiming African territories. The culmination of this imperialist competition was the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, a meeting that would shape the future of Africa in profound and often devastating ways. Remarkably, not a single African representative was invited to the table where the fate of their lands and people was decided. Background: the Scramble for Africa. By the late 1800s, European nations were competing for influence and resources across the globe. Africa, with its vast mineral wealth, fertile lands, and strategic locations, became a primary target for colonial expansion. Prior to the Berlin Conference, European incursions into Africa were mostly limited to coastal trading posts and a few isolated settlements. However, as technological advancements made inland exploration more feasible, the race to claim African territories intensified. This unregulated competition led to conflicts between European powers, as well as brutal exploitation and violence against African communities. To avoid direct military confrontations among themselves and to formalize their claims, the European powers sought to establish rules for the colonization of Africa. The Berlin Conference, dividing a continent. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European countries and the United States gathered in Berlin at the invitation of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The purpose of the conference was to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa. Over the course of several months, these diplomats and leaders carved up the African continent into territories that would be controlled by the various European powers. The key decisions made at the Berlin Conference included principle of effective occupation. European powers were required to establish authority in the areas they claimed. This meant building infrastructure, establishing administration, and maintaining a military presence. Free trade zones. The Congo Basin and Niger River regions were designated as free trade zones where all European nations could operate without interference. The Congo Free State. King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal control over the Congo Free State, a decision that would lead to one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history. As a result of the conference, borders were drawn with little regard for the existing ethnic, cultural, and linguistic divisions among African peoples. Entire communities were split between different colonial powers, while rival groups were forced together under artificial borders. The European powers prioritized their own economic and political interests, disregarding the complex social and political landscapes of the African continent. The absence of African voices. One of the most glaring injustices of the Berlin Conference was the complete exclusion of African representatives. The decisions made during the conference were based entirely on European perspectives, with no consideration for the wishes or rights of the African people. The conference essentially legitimized the theft of African land and resources, setting the stage for decades of exploitation and oppression. African leaders and communities were left to deal with the consequences of decisions made thousands of miles away, with no say in the process. The arbitrary borders drawn by the European powers would lead to numerous conflicts and tensions in the following decades, many of which continue to affect Africa today. Aftermath and legacy. The Berlin Conference had a profound and lasting impact on Africa. By 1914, nearly 90% of the continent was under European control. The arbitrary borders and colonial administrations imposed by the European powers disrupted traditional societies, economies, and governance structures. The legacy of these borders can still be seen in the modern map of Africa, where many of the political boundaries established during the Berlin Conference remain in place. The exploitation of Africa's resources and people during the colonial period led to immense suffering and stunted the continent's development. The Berlin Conference is often cited as a symbol of the injustices of colonialism and the destructive impact of European imperialism on Africa. A continent divided. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 stands as a stark reminder of the power dynamics that have shaped global history. The division of Africa, without the presence of a single African voice, illustrates the deep disregard for the sovereignty and humanity of African peoples by the European powers. The conference set the stage for decades of colonization, exploitation, and conflict, the effects of which are still felt across Africa today. The story of the Berlin Conference is not just a historical event. It is a crucial chapter in understanding the complex legacies of colonialism and the ongoing struggles for self-determination, justice, and unity in Africa.
Right. Wow. The conference ran from November 15th, 1884 to February the 26th, 1885. So that makes it 140 years this week that the conference ended. 14 countries were represented, including all the major players, all the major thieves, like Great Britain. That's why you hear, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, the French, of course, the Germans, the Portuguese. Now, obviously, no African leaders or representatives were invited, despite, obviously, the profound impact that these decisions would have on the continent. Key outcomes included principle of effective occupation, which required nations to prove they could control and administer the territories that they claimed, often through treaties. If you're watching online, you can see me holding up ellipses, but I'm for the people on the radio, you can't see it, but I'm holding up ellipses. Treaties, because I say that because they generally had no intention of upholding any treaties with local leaders or military presence. The conference also carved up much of Africa into spheres of influence with arbitrary borders that ignored cultural, ethnic, or linguistic realities. Now, this is important to talk about because much of the narrative about sub-Saharan Africa that we have today is that Africans can't govern themselves. Africans can't rule themselves. Look at how much chaos there's been in Africa. This is why, this is why the white man had to come and rule over them. Well, the white man set arbitrary borders and forced different tribes and groups of people together that weren't together. We've seen countless amounts of infighting within Europe, and these are boundaries that they themselves set. We had 2 world wars that killed almost 100 million people based on colonial borders that the Europeans themselves set for themselves. But they criticize Africans to say Africans can't rule themselves because it is hard for them to live within borders that Europeans set. And again, this goes back to, the narratives of our media, the narratives of the governments in our society that tell us these things to justify the continued colonialism and now neo-colonialism in Africa. This is why it's okay that we kill Muammar Gaddafi and steal Libya's oil. But this has a huge effect. It has blowback. Muammar Gaddafi told everybody before he died, he said, look, if you kill me, Europe is going to turn black. He literally said that. Europe is going to turn black. And what has happened since Obama and NATO killed him? Europe hasn't been able to get an ounce of rest because whether it's Italy, Rome, Italy, or the United Kingdom, or France, or Germany, all these people keep coming from Africa. Because Muammar Gaddafi was absorbing all the people who were running from ISIS and Boko Haram and all the terrorist groups. He was absorbing them, protecting them, especially if they were black. A lot of people don't know Muammar Gaddafi tried to unite the African continent. Tried to get all the African leaders off of the United States and Western Europe's hit list, basically being hit up of all those resources that they have. He was going to say, look, let's stop trading for our oil for US dollars. Let's create an African gold dinar that they will have to pay us for. They will have to trade in our currency. And they killed him. Barack Obama killed him. Hillary Clinton killed him. NATO killed him because he wanted to get Africans free from this 140 years of since the scramble of Africa, colonialism. That's why this is important 140 years later. And this conference happened in 1885. This was already after almost 3 centuries of, free-for-all colonialism and slavery that they had gotten. They had already stolen all of us, or kidnapped all of us, or bought all of us, depending on the circumstance. And so Africa was already in a weakened state because much of its young population had been sold off or kidnapped over 2 or 3 centuries. The Congo Basin was a focal point. This was designated as the Congo Free State under the personal control of Belgium's King Leopold II, leading to an insane amount of destruction. Now, if King Leopold had killed white people like Hitler did, King Leopold would be one of the most infamous human beings who ever lived. I mean, he already kind of is, but he is nowhere near the level of Hitler or Joseph Stalin or people like that, and he should be. King Leopold II is responsible for the death of 10 million Congolese people. 10 million. Murdered, brutalized, raped, and maimed for the rubber trade. They discovered the rubber trees in Congo, and he was in charge of it, and so he made those people slaves. And if you did not do exactly what he wanted you to do, he had your arms cut off, or he had your head cut off, or he had your family killed. 10 million people. And this was in the early 20th century. This wasn't some long, long time ago that nobody could possibly have any pictures. There are graphic pictures. You could go Google them. Google what King Leopold did in Congo. You can see the black people with no arms, no legs, decapitated babies. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and forever, nobody's allowed to say anything other than Hitler's the worst human being in the history of the world. King Leopold killed 10 million people just in the Congo. And most people walking around this city right now, that in itself is a product of exploitation. Most people walking around the city of Gary, East Chicago, Hammond, I guarantee you most of you guys don't know who King Leopold II is. That is the power of narratives. That is the power of being able to shape a story the way you want to shape it and make the bad guys you want to be the bad guys. The Belgians should be vilified to this day for what they did in the Congo. They are not. They tell you Vladimir Putin's the bad guy. Oh, well, how many African countries did Vladimir Putin and Russia overthrow? Oh, how about none? How many African leaders did Vladimir Putin and Russia, and even during the Soviet Union, Stalin and them, how many African countries did they destroy? None. But to this day, they want you to send hundreds of billions of dollars to Zelensky because, oh man, Russia's the worst country in the world. And China, oh, these countries, China hasn't bombed anybody since 1979. They have not dropped a bomb since 1979. Meanwhile, the United States, or the Great Satan, as many people in the Middle East call it, has gone around the world and methodically bombed the Middle East, bombed Africans, killed millions of people, probably tens of millions of people over the last 2 decades in the war on terror, killed millions of innocent people in Iraq. And they want you to believe that America's the good guy, that the French are the good guys, that the British are the good. Really? You want to compare death counts? I don't think you do. I don't think you want to compare death counts. Seriously. I don't think you want that. And to this day, we are left with the vestiges of the Scramble of Africa. You look at Congo today. I talked about this a few months ago when I talked about how the U.S. government used entertainment entertainers like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. They toured around Africa in the early 60s. And the U.S. government actually used a tour by Louis Armstrong to once again overthrow Congo's government and kill their leader, Patrice Lumumba. The CIA were a part of Louis Armstrong's entourage. Now, he didn't know this. He didn't know this. He didn't know the people working with him were CIA. He just thought they were people helping him put on a tour. But they used the pretext of a tour, a jazz ambassadorship, where this American black man is going to come over and perform for his people, his ancestral people, the black folks in Africa. They used that as an opportunity to infiltrate Congo and overthrow their government and kill their leader once again. And in the place of Patrice Lumumba, they put Mobutu, one of the most sadistic, twisted, psychotic dictators in the world. And he ruled for 30 years, into the 90s. Fleeced the country for everything it's worth. So when they tell you that Africans can't govern themselves, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about, well, after we put people in charge that raped and pillaged and brutalized all these people, they don't do so well after that. Again, Vladimir Putin didn't overthrow Congo's government and put Mobutu in charge of it. The United States and Belgium did that. And the people of Congo today are suffering today. We've covered that in the past as well. They are in the midst of a civil war. All of this is a product of what we are talking about right now, European colonialism. The leaders that we have propped up have massacred and brutalized people. It goes back to trauma in the first segment. Just imagine how many people in Congo right now have witnessed their families, their friends brutalized, murdered, raped. How many sadistic and twisted things that have been done to people in their communities in the name of Western imperialism? These are the people who tell you about capitalism and communism and socialism. Oh my God, it's the communists. Dude, the communists did not enslave black people for hundreds of years. Matter of fact, the communists minded their own damn business in Africa for the most part. The socialists ain't the ones who did all that in Africa. That was good old-fashioned American, Western, imperialist capitalists who did all that in Africa, who killed all those people, who left generations of people brutalized and suffering. Just remember that, folks. Just remember that. And here we are 140 years later. Africa is still in tatters. We walk around much of the Western world, the black people who are products of Africa and Western colonialism. Our communities are in tatters as well in the name of economic exploitation. And who did it? Who did it? You better believe it wasn't a socialist. All right, folks. When we come back, we're going to mop up. I'll be right back after these.